All right. Well, why don't you tell me a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so I'm an ESL teacher,
Oh, where?
and I live in Canada, Saskatchewan,
Okay.
Regina. And yeah, I lived in India initially, of course, and I moved here about 4 years ago.
Okay.
I did some studies in Toronto, and then I moved here. My parents live in Saskatchewan, so
Okay.
I moved here.
Moved about 4 years ago. All right.
Yeah.
Um, how did you find my channel?
I am reluctant to say so, but I think it was probably through the algorithm and through like the Jordan Peterson videos.
Yeah. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
was a initial fanboy of his and jumped
Oh.
off the bandwagon, as you've probably seen by my comments.
Well, tell me more about that. That's interesting.
Well, like, initially, of course, I think it's something that you've addressed quite thoroughly in your videos, where you've talked about like how he caught the wave right at the point where it was rising to its peak. Like there was all these questions that were bubbling under the surface
Yeah.
in terms of what people were, all the neglected questions that people failed to ask in popular discourse that
Hmm.
were just bubbling under the surface. So the moment somebody addressed like any one of them, even like tangentially, it was like, oh, finally someone saying,
So that's
yeah,
why he bubbled up. Why did you jump off the wave?
yeah, because that was it. Because I was just like looking for someone vicariously to
Okay.
express like even like some semblance of the questions which I had, which weren't being addressed anywhere, even like in the more obscure online pathways,
Okay.
like more
Okay.
obscure like online like debates which don't even get that many views. Those points weren't even being brought up there, but he managed to bring up quite a few of those.
Yeah.
So when the resonance hits you in different like levels, kind of like makes you want to latch onto him, and you're kind of rooting for him. It became a bit of a hero worshipping thing.
Yeah. Yeah. So what are you interested in?
Philosophy for sure.
Philosophy for sure. What kind of philosophy?
Of course, I'm just a novice and a rookie and all that, but
Oh, we all
philosophy,
are. There's too much philosophy to be an expert of it. There's not many experts.
yeah, metaphysics
Okay.
probably is like my prime area of interest.
Okay.
Just like what what lies at the surface of our apprehension of any topic. Like even my primary of interest is especially like when people talk about science and mathematics, like what lies right below the surface. Like when you understand something, you're always understanding it based on some prior knowledge. I don't know if you can use the word knowledge, but some prior ability to apprehend it. Like anything, no matter how complex the topic is, all the mathematics and all the philosophy that exists in the world, all the science, it's presumed that we can somehow apprehend it.
Mm.
Like that's like an unspoken presumption of the scientific method or
Mm-hmm.
mathematics, that all of this could be apprehended in some fashion due to some ability. That's
Mm-hmm.
like understanding that ability is my prime concern.
Okay. Okay. Are you religious at all?
I grew up Methodist,
Methodist. Okay.
yeah, and yeah, now I'm as usual. That as with many people in this meaning crisis world, I'm grappling with all those questions.
Okay.
I mean, of course, the Methodist Church and its doctrines. Of course, I know I'm not like a strict adherent to any of that, but just the faith itself.
Okay. Well, what was on your mind? What did you want to talk about today?
I've got it's
Oh,
so
you got a
garbled,
list. All right.
and to be honest, I'm a bit of a fanboy, so I'm a bit starstruck, to be honest.
Oh, dude, that'll pass. That'll pass. Don't worry about that.
Where to start? Okay, so actually, I want to talk about Calvinism a bit.
Oh, okay. That's a fun thing for a Methodist to want to get into.
I mean, I'm not really, like, I'm not here to defend Methodist versus Calvinist. I'm just
That's fine.
actually, like, to some degree, I'm a bit ignorant actually, like to what your like how you would construe the concept, like how the concepts in your conception of like determinism and that dialectic between determinism and agency, how that fits into your conception of Calvinism.
Well, so Calvin is a funny thing, because Calvin is always known for this specific area, even though in terms of his writing, it by no means was a predominant area. It came to predominance about 100 years after Calvin, when I think what was happening in European philosophy was that God, number one, was sort of receding. Deism was coming to the fore. And so all of these issues of determinism versus free will sort of got thrust onto the theological stage. And the major Calvinist doctrine that looks at the major Calvinist document that looks at this question is really the Canons of Dort, which came out of the Synod of Dort in 1619. And that was, in many ways, a multinational Protestant ecumenical synod, Reformed ecumenical synod that had a lot of other forces going on, as many things in the history of Protestantism did. There was very much an urban versus rural dynamic to it. There was very much a new Enlightenment thought versus kind of an anti-Enlightenment aspect to it. And so what my tradition, the Dutch Calvinists that I grew up in, sort of were the Calvinists that they were kind of the perpetual opposition to the newest thing down the line. And so the way that worked itself out would be a strong doctrinal priority to things like divine election, perseverance of the saints, all of these 5 points of Calvinism that come down through the Canons of Dort. But what has always caught my attention about this is that, number one, if you read Calvin, so there's Richard Mueller was a Calvin scholar that taught for a number of years at Calvin Seminary, my alma mater. And part of he wrote a very interesting paper and gave this talk in a few places, asking the question, was Calvin a Calvinist? Because these points weren't necessarily prominent in Calvin's thought, partly because these points were shared by Lutherans and Roman Catholics. These were not controversial points. And I think the reason they weren't controversial points was because philosophically they were simply uninteresting, because in a number of ways it was the action of God in things like providence, that you can read about that in the Heidelberg Catechism, Lord's Day 10, where God brings fat years and lean years, and God is doing all of this choosing. Once God sort of continued to recede through deism and then through ongoing secularism, the question of God being an active agent in the history of the world that could stop things like floods and fires, that suddenly became an issue. And so all of these new ideas, became battlegrounds, and they were treated as battlegrounds of conservative versus progressive movements. And so when you get to, say, Methodism, the Methodism very much comes on the wake of people saying, okay, well, we have to choose. But that has all sorts of philosophical stuff behind it, getting it to that place. Because if you go back and you look at Calvin's life, or read his Institutes, or read the Bible, well, why would Calvin preach if he didn't believe that the people listening to him had to choose to do the right thing? In other words, Calvin very easily was able to hold his double predestination in the same book as all these admonitions towards all kinds of things people were supposed to do. So in my opinion, whatever Calvinism should mean, it certainly means a certain sort of compatibilism where we very much see God as a chooser, which you see in texts like Ephesians and a whole number of biblical texts, but also an arena where we are active agents who have will and choice. And so I think, and what happened in inter-church fights between Arminians and Calvinists is that Calvinists begin taking on this weird position where they've got God doing all this decreeing, and then at the same time, when they go into church, they're admonishing people to live holy lives and do all kinds of things. And so at some point, you begin to wonder, well, what's with this? And so for the Arminians, it was just easiest to just, well, we're just going to get rid of all of this talk about predestination and election and all of that, and we're just going to make everything about choice. Okay. The difficulty that you have when you do that, though, is what do you do with all these passages of the Bible where God knows everything in advance and everything's written in the book and all of this stuff? And so the problem is that you had worldviews that very easily were capable of holding a very sovereign God and human agency. And so to me, in fact, the older traditions of which Calvin is an heir is able to hold that. And so I'm reluctant to throw out this very sovereign God. Because either way, because of the philosophical issues that came to the fore, either way, you're going to have a problem. And so I'd rather sort of be someone who says, well, you know what? I think we're going to keep a very sovereign God, like we find in the canons of Dort, and also say, well, people have responsibility to choose, because I don't see how we're going to get around that either. So ask me to square it. I'll just tell you I can't. I don't know how to do it.
In the previous videos as well.
Yeah. So that's sort of where I come down on that. And then people want to bring in Molinism, which is, I see people using all of these ideas of foreknowledge, and I look at that and I say, well, okay, we're sort of trying to rig something up.
Was Molinism,
I don't know.
Was Molinism the one where God has foreknowledge of the unknown variables that we can't see? Is that the one?
Yeah, it has to do with foreknowledge, and almost even Arminianism is a way to try to, it's a Calvinist heresy, actually. You know, it's sort of like all Protestants are at a deeper level Catholics. Arminians are at a deeper level Calvinists. They're just protesting a certain aspect of the rest of Calvin. And that's kind of the way it is. And then Molinism is a way to sort of square it. And I don't find that debate terribly interesting. So when people want to fight about it, I usually just shrug, because I don't think we know enough to answer questions about what it's like to be God. We don't even know what it's like to be us. So then a lot of questions like that, I simply try my best to defer to Scripture and say, this is what Scripture seems to teach, so I'm going to go with that. And call me a heretic if you want. I can't stop you. So if you're nice and you just want to think it and not say it, that's okay too.
No, for me the question with determinism in the age of decay, in the current age, is, since how does the fall fit into your doctrine? Because, okay, so let me try and if I can get this out so abstract. So at the fall, like in my conception of the fall, like, I mean, I'm not completely clear on this, but at the fall, it's quite clear that the gap between human beings and God emerges.
Yes.
But then at the same time, does the rest of creation also fall? And human beings, because I think that's a key issue when it comes for me to square God's determinism or God's predestination, because if creation also fell in the fall, and first of all, did creation have the same kind of free will or agency that man has, so that it could warp itself in its own way, or did God specify exactly how it would be warped? Because both of those, I mean, the first one is less disturbing than the second option, where God says no, and now there's going to be like baby birds which come out and smash their brother's skull in. That seems, I don't know, on an aesthetic metaphysical level, that seems disturbing to me. Because I don't know, it harkens back to like a pagan god almost.
Yeah.
I mean, and so how does the dialect, how does the fall fit in with like a version? I mean, again, I know this is not like but just for me, just for someone like you with your knowledge to try and help me square this, how would you place the fall in line with God's? Because I do agree between like the narrative structure is like the narrative structure of history is a way for God to, his glory to be revealed.
Yes.
But at the same time, was like with the fall, how does that change God's initial picture for how the narrative would flow? Like what would your best guess be?
Well, so there's an old fight in my tradition that came about in the early and mid 20th century between infralapsarianism and supralapsarianism. And that fight essentially pits basically asks the question, to what degree did God how did God think about the fall? Did he ordain it? Well, that would make God the author of evil, so you can't say that. So when did God think about this? So basically, so you have this problem, you have the question of divine election. So did God elect people before the fall? Well, before the foundation of the earth. Well, why would God elect people before the fall? Well, he knew the fall was going to happen. Okay, well, hosts of questions come up that we can't answer. Okay. And what's part of what's interesting is that, and these questions are still live, and these questions are by no means new or brought up by the Protestant reformers. Church fathers like Irenaeus wrestled with questions like this, Origen. But what's interesting when you look at, say, the wrestling of some of these questions in the 20th and 21st century, and you see the wrestling of these questions in the, let's say, the 2nd and 3rd century, the philosophical and historical context of these wrestlings are also quite different. So I like to say things like part of what, let's say in Genesis 1, we have this thing that when I was taught Reformed doctrine as a youth, we called the cultural mandate, which is be fruitful and multiply and have dominion over the earth. And one of the things that Genesis early chapters talks about is human dominion over the rest of nature. And so what happens when we rebel from God? Well, there are lots of ways to talk about this. One way to talk about it would be that when we rebel from God, nature rebels against us. And that seems to be a fairly a way of talking about it that resonates with people. The difficulty that far beyond Christian conversations have wrestled with has been, why does nature seem so hostile to us? And the conceptualization of the rebellion and the fall is one way to answer that. Obviously other pagan ways to answer that were Gnostic ways that said that the creator of the material world was a second-rate God as opposed to the creator of the immaterial world. So you have these dualisms. So there's all these kinds of ways to engage that. What Christianity and Calvinism in particular tries to lay at our feet, which is a tough thing to lay at humanity's feet, is, okay, so the evil we find in creation was brought here by us, by humanity. Now, that then runs into issues like, well, are tsunamis evil? are predatory animals like lions and tigers and bears evil? So questions just go on and on and on. And again, I can't pretend to know all of these answers. The best I usually do as a pastor is do a lot of listening to someone and try and find a framing of a reformed answer that might address their questions as best I could, rather than concocting some overall, monarchical vision answer that answers all of these questions and all of their potentiality. So again, for me, Alvin Plantinga, who's a philosopher, grew up Christian Reformed, taught at Calvin College. His brother Neil was my systematics prof at Calvin Seminary. Alvin Plantinga, in his book God, Freedom, and Evil, basically runs through the problem of evil and says it's not really a philosophical problem, but it is a pastoral problem. And I take that to heart. So when people bring me questions of this nature, I try to offer pastoral answers to do something to frame their suffering within a larger picture. But answering these questions is so hard. So maybe that's a tremendously long and unsatisfying response to your question. I don't know.
No, I really, and of course, I think anyone who thinks of this, like just even without having read the literature would I kind of like the idea of like creation rebelling against man. That makes, again, like you said, it has a resonance. And to me, it makes metaphysical sense perfectly. But then there are perversions in nature which are like beyond the scope of how nature interacts with us.
Yeah.
I mean, of course,
perversions.
Of course, you're saying perversion. You're using
as we see them.
God standards against
right.
God, Christianity against God. But like, so the way I see it is like, of course, like you said, I cannot use God's standards against him, but he has put those standards in me. And he has like, even though I have the broken image, even though I have the broken fallen image of God, there is still like, when we try and understand something about the Bible, we are still trying to apply this process of using some part of us to understand, or whatever broken compass, whatever broken internal resonance that we can have, we're still trying to use that to navigate the Bible. And I think I see us shelving that, of course, within the church, shelving that for issues which are difficult. Shelving. Yeah. So,
well, like, I'd say we shelve them when we're probably on stage on Sunday morning, because the vast majority of our audience is usually dealing with fairly common issues, but those issues are probably not shelved in the quiet of a home visit or a pastoral conversation. And that's part of what. So now we have this thing called YouTube, where we seem to have near limited bandwidth to talk about just about any obscurity under the sun. So now actually on YouTube, we can do some of this processing, whereas church time has a very limited bandwidth, which right now in contemporary America, basically a pastor has sermon time between 20 minutes or an hour to deal with something. And maybe a Sunday school where you get another hour, but people don't afford church a whole lot of time. But as you go down lower into Bible studies or discussion groups or something like that, you can begin to work on some of these issues. And actually, in all fairness, in the church, there's lots of stuff written about this kind of stuff. But sort of what I think we've gotten used to in our culture is a certain laziness, which says, oh, I've got this idea, I want an answer to it right now. And I think the answer would be, well, this might be something you're going to have to work on for the next few years. We're like, what do you mean next few years? I want my answer now. And so even via YouTube or the internet or something, you can actually get quite a few of the menu answers quickly. But there are so many of these kinds of questions out there too, that it does take a community and an organization to work on them. But they're really hard. I like, on this particular question, I like a lot of what C.S. Lewis tends to do with it, because he tends to reach back and see nature as a fairly wild thing. that wildness, C.S. Lewis sort of manages to frame as something which is, it might not be to our liking, but
Aslan.
sometimes Aslan, exactly, but sometimes it is. And so there's a lot more going on there than we usually are ready to admit.
Again, I don't really ask this question out of just pedantic curiosity. It's more because it gets to the heart of almost one of the major differences between even Eastern and West, and Christianity, Eastern religion and Christianity, where again, I'm making a broad oversimplification, but in the Eastern or more pagan realms, good and evil are just co-actors, or you can play the role of the evil person, you can play the role of the good person. So the good isn't really ultimately truly the good. It's kind of, they're both on equal footing of sorts. Yeah. So when I ask the question, when language trips me up, when I say there are perversions in nature, what I'm trying to get at is what in my broken image I can still kind of see as ultimately good, and the beautiful and the pure, and whatever Paul says in that verse, I don't know.
Yeah.
Is that really the good? Or if it's not, and there is some way in which this all just has this narrative structure and you need both the good and the bad, it kind of goes back to Eastern religion, or that kind of the fallen dialectic being at the heart of reality, or the yin-yang dialectic being at the heart of reality, which I don't know.
Yeah.
Which is what I was trying to avoid.
Yeah. I think part of what happens in Christianity, especially in some Western traditions like Calvinism, is that God is so sovereign. God just fills up everything that in sometimes some unbiblical ways, and certain biblical scholars have been playing with, because if you actually read the Bible, which is supposed to be the thing that critiques my confessional theology, you have the Elohim, you have, I was at a classis meeting and we sang praise God from whom all blessings flow, praise God above the heavenly hosts. And every time I sing that now, I think, now what are y'all thinking in your mind those heavenly hosts are? Are they gods? And even in the New Testament, you have these principalities and powers. In other words, so often a careful reading of the Bible shows that there's a lot more going on than our Protestant Western imaginary seems to afford. And missiologists have been making this point for a number of years. There's the excluded middle. And for example, in the Reformed doctrine that I was raised with, to what degree does this category of chaos fit into what we're talking about? And what is God's relationship with chaos? And again, if you read the Old Testament and the New, there are passages where okay, so God brings the hordes of Babylon on down against his chosen people, and this is God's choice for them. And we hear that, and we think, all that raping and pillaging, is that what God wants? And so I think some of the tightness of certain traditions that we inherited from, say, the Protestant Reformation, that didn't have a lot of knowledge that we've sort of dug up in the last 200 years in terms of archaeology and learned from other cultures. It wasn't really able to incorporate those things. So there's a lot going on. But again, in most church systems, churches sort of lead with, okay, this is what we can, we got to fit this into this spoon. There's a lot out there, but I'm just going to give you this spoon. And that's part of what goes on in church.
Yeah. I mean, again, it's so hard to just again, the way, if I could just lay it, and this will be the last on this topic, because I know this has got to have a lot of words that fudge in it.
Yeah.
And a lot of Christian language that people are going to, I mean, if you do choose to post it, people would be like, what the heck are they talking about?
This one's fun already. No, don't. This is a fun video. This one people will want to watch.
There's a lot of, it's kind of like a scientifically minded person would look at it and say, I mean, loosely using that word, would be like a bunch of gobbledygook.
Yeah,
just
yeah,
like
yeah. Word salad.
It's like, exactly. But, and the Christian people will be like, oh, it's still pedantic.
Well, or they'll just shoot at us for our various positions, because
that's true.
Christianity in some ways is like trench warfare in World War I. Everybody's defending their lines for fights that everybody else is like, why are you fighting over that?
So how I've squared it in my brain, like so far, I like, again, it's going to sound simplistic as hell. God created a perfect order. Again, why did the perfect triune God living in perfect love and union suddenly decide to make the world and have this narrative structure flow? That's the question. But God had an initial perfect plan. Man truly rebelled, truly creating a plan which was not the initial plan. But also, at some point, I don't know how chronology even works metaphysically and in terms of the details of Satan is in the world because he's operant. So that was the piece I was initially missing earlier. So Satan, who was an angel of considerable power, was able to maybe affect the perversion that I would call perversion that is apparent throughout the world. And at the same time, when Adam and Eve sin, they go into rebellion, and nature, who's like C.S. Lewis says is a sibling, is now in contention with humanity. So that's one part of the fallen dialectic. And the other part is Satan is now running amok and creating, and that's the only way I am able to like square it.
Well, that's a very good way, and that squares with a lot of the Bible.
And the only reason I can put a little bit of merit in my notion of what perversion and evil is because, again, like I think I posted on one of your comments, not that you would have remembered any of you have thousands of comments, but I posted like once saying metaphysics, and I'm such a fan, there's a certain point which will get it to you. There's a certain point which it will get you to just by following the logic. But at some point you need the revelation, and the revelation of what true goodness or the face of God is to me is Jesus.
Yeah.
So by looking at Jesus, I can get a fair idea of what he would consider perversion is just by, and I would consider some of those things.
But now we should also keep in mind, if we're going to be canonical Christians, there's Jesus in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. There's also Jesus in Revelation. And Jesus in Revelation, begins as this, the Son of Man figure with a two-edged sword coming out of his mouth, riding a war horse, and the people of the earth screaming, for the mountains to fall on them, because save them from the one on the throne. And so, I mean, these are difficult things.
I've resolved that by saying Revelation, I only look at what the Jesus who was recorded on earth. So that's my punting.
Yeah, but see, the book of Revelation is one of my favorite books in the Bible because for so many reasons. It's just an astoundingly complex masterpiece of revising Old Testament material with the revelation of Jesus Christ. And so it's applied, but it's applied in terms of this, dramatic symbolism. And so, yeah. But no, you're exactly right. Jesus calls us Abba, but part of the picture of Jesus is his crucifixion. In fact, that's very central. And what does it say about God to abandon his son on a cross? I mean, you can't just look at, some of the stuff that Jesus says and not incorporate also the crucifixion into that, but also the resurrection. So
but the crucifixion was still perpetrated by man, the evil of man.
Yes. Well, shouldn't God like send down warm fuzzies? I mean, that's the heart of the classical world. I was just listening to Glenn. I always say his name wrong. Scrivener talked to Tom Holland, and the thing that the classical world could not understand, and Islam has the same objection, how God could let his son be crucified. I mean, that makes no sense if you've got if you've got a worldview that looks like Job's three friends. And that alignment of God allowing his son to be crucified is incredibly important when we see things in the world that we say, how could a loving God allow that to happen? So, go ahead.
I can kind of, I can see that that's a major momentous symbolic event / continuing event. I mean, not continuing event, but something of continuing import. But I could always kind of understand that, because in my own heart, I was thinking, since as by nature humans, we're aspiring creatures, I always thought, I always like, but I can kind of understand why Lucifer aspired to be God. And in fact, without Jesus coming down, it doesn't, if they would, and dying and actually suffering, there would always be that gap between us and God, in the sense of, but it's easy for you to say because you haven't suffered. You haven't actually, and then he's like, okay, I'll come down and literally take the worst possible, oh, that's the worst possible suffering, being nailed to it, I'll do that. And now it's like, is gap close now? And now it's like, okay, now Christ our brother, but Christ is God, he's our father. Now we're in the, now there's no more separation. So I could always kind of understand that in that way, but I still see that as man still perpetrated the evil. But again, going back to the initial question, of course, God wasn't just reacting to what was happening. So I do see like how the arguments of God's perfect ordaining of everything is there, because God knew at the beginning, like, that's the biggest question. If God is so perfect, triune, why did he even create this entire?
Yeah, that's a big question. That's a big, well, and again, so even your framing of it before, because I can frame it in another way. I can say, okay, well, let's say that you have a daughter, a precious daughter, a daughter that you love, and she's wonderful and innocent and beautiful and perfect. Think about the worst neighborhood in the world that you know. Would you let your daughter go into that neighborhood? And if your daughter went into that neighborhood unescorted by you and let bad things happen, and then your daughter cries out to you, and you could do something fairly simple. I mean, if a couple of angels can blind the whole town of Sodom and lead, getting Jesus off the cross would be no big deal, which is exactly what Jesus mockers note. He saved others, he couldn't save himself. And if you see the amazing things that Jesus does in the story, and even at a very human level, the whole way up to the cross, it's shown step by step as, Jesus talks to Pilate. The worst attorney in the world could get Jesus out of that. I mean, Pilate did not want to crucify him. His wife's like, don't touch him. And Pilate's like, I don't want to do a favor for these people. I hate these people. Give me a chance to stick it to them. Just say something. And Jesus is like, and so, and the narrative has built into it all of these complexities that I think are extremely helpful for affording us the idea that God is, I see this all the time, God takes the kind of risks that we look at as irresponsible. And so that's why I tell people, don't play chicken with God, because you think you take risks? Read the Bible. God takes the kind of risks that none of us would tell anybody to take. But then again, this gets into another one of my things, that God is more so. God is more loving and more hazardous. And again, Lewis brings that into Aslan. And I think Lewis in terms of the 20th century, I think was able to talk about these things better than a lot of people, but they challenge us, I think, at all of the ways that we Freud imagines that we sort of project ourselves up into the sky and imagine ourselves to be God. And that's fair. And that's true. We do that. And then God keeps doing things that say, you think you're God? Watch me do this. You think you're good? Watch me do this. You think you take risks? Watch me do this. And at some point, as we have to say, if I'm God, if I'm my own God, I've got a really bad God. But then, of course, the whole issue comes down to trust. Can I trust a God who would let his cherished son go into an awful neighborhood, be brutalized by its inhabitants, and give him amazing power, and he does nothing? And Garden of Gethsemane, I mean, the whole story is just, the more you understand that story, it's just, it's revelation. That's the way I see it.
I mean, yeah. There's nothing more I can really add to that. And now I just want to now completely take a left turn.
Yeah, time is limited. You use it. I'm sorry, I'm probably talking too long.
Yeah. No, I don't want to talk. I want to hear you, but on these particular topics. So I have this one. This is just random out of the blue. So causation and now these are just two. Not just realizations, thoughts, I don't know, challenges almost to a lot of people. Challenges to the concepts of causation and also challenges regarding the concepts of emergence.
Yeah.
So this is to more secular-minded view of both these concepts. With causation, how can, I don't understand how anyone talks about causation without the idea of an agent. For instance, if everything in the universe is perfectly correlated. Let's just say the causal chain, the chain of correlations is unbroken. For us to even go in and say that a certain event leads to another event, how can you even say that without invoking an agent? Because everything is correlated perfectly.
Yeah.
It's all, you don't know. So the way we do it is we go in and say, we interfere with the system, and then the system morphs. We interfere with the system again, it morphs in another way. It morphs in another way. And then we find the similarities between the way the system morphs and say, okay, this is the real principle underlying the system. Or this is the real principle that underlies the system. But that couldn't have even happened if there was no agent. Even on the most basic metaphysical level, how can you even speak of it? How can you even speak of something causing something else? Or this is the ultimate structure of reality without even bringing in the agent? It makes no sense to me. Yeah. So that's just a challenge I'm throwing out to the comment section. And of course, I want to hear your thoughts on it.
No, that's a great point. I'm always reading too many books at once, so I'm rereading the Metaphysical Club, and the American pragmatists get into these issues, and they're really hard issues, because just as you, I think, nicely articulated, when you're talking about these causal events, the agent is, well, where does the agent come from? And even the way we use language kind of excludes the agent as something apart from that. And so I can understand the desire to have everything just dissolve into some grand determinism, but that doesn't necessarily solve the problems either. So these are really interesting problems, and I think part of the reason that they keep coming up all the time is because it's just sort of how we work, because things are working in front of us and say, oh, I'm causing this, and that framework excludes me from the causal connection, which, it's so funny, because we have these dominant paradigms like materialism, and then we're going all over the place talking about human caused climate change, and it's like, well, wait a minute, if humanity is just simply a part of nature,
exactly,
you can't talk about that unless you assume we are capable creatures of everybody doing certain things in order to reverse this, and so on and so forth. So no, you're exactly right. It's a great point, and it's a point that, but to make these points with people, it's really hard for a lot of people to grasp that, because again, we're so busy looking for opportunities and avoiding threats, and that just grabs our salience landscape, and a subtle point like that just wing over people's heads.
And it's kind of a point which has no pragmatic utility, because you act as if that is, in fact, when I find it always funny when Jordan Peterson like says that I'm a pragmatist, but like science was very pragmatic. Like all the assumptions which are built into science was very pragmatic. So this is not like some new philosophy which is in opposition with science. Like,
right,
the entire, like, all of materialist science is based on pragmatic assumptions at every level.
Yeah.
And it's a pragmatic assumption to assume that there is causes, because that leads you to have sufficient faith to go in and act as if that happens, and then discoveries galore.
Right.
Applications galore.
Well, and I mean, I was reading in the Metaphysical Club today, and I think it was Pierce who, in one of his papers, basically pointed out in the paper that causation is this thing that's just sort of out there, that everyone imagines is sort of just out there. It's simply a presupposition. And can you defend causation? It's like, at some point there's just the pieces on the board. You play with the pieces that you have in front of you, but people act like all the pieces are simply self-evident, and no, it's way more complex than that.
And with emergence, I think this is like the most neglected point. People, like, I think that's the biggest like get out of jail free card that I've ever seen people pull. Like, oh, and then this happens and it emerges. So okay, so you're saying ultimately, I mean, not you, but the picture is ultimately everything boils down to the most basic fundamental level of reality. What that is, let's just say for now it's quantum physics. Where in quantum physics is it encoded that this particular next level of reality is going to be encoded? And the quantum particles have no concept that they're human beings walking around at some arbitrarily detached level of reality. And why should any laws of logic that we could apprehend apply at those higher levels? Why shouldn't they just be completely governed by what's happening below that? Like, why would we act or why would we speak in such a way that evolution, for example, there's no randomness in the worldview of the people who propose evolution. There is no such thing. There's only epistemological randomness. There's no ontological randomness. It's all just our failure to be able to comprehend the variables.
That's right.
So in that sense, everything is already predetermined. Everything is being pre-selected. Everything's another time. Why is linear time assumed in evolution when all the other science says that there is no linear time? So it's just the block theory of time, where the past, the present, the future exist simultaneously. So why would we assume that it makes sense now and any design is explained away because it's moving like this when it's actually not moving like this? It's not moving linearly. I don't see how those questions go unexplored.
Oh, because we don't like to explore questions that bother us. We like to explore the questions that we like to explore, that usually often questions that fit whatever worldview we have for whatever motivation is underneath, which most of the time we don't even know that either. So no, those are all great questions. I love that. I might title this talk, "Emergence is the biggest get out of jail free card." That's a great line. I'm using Leo Laporte's episode naming strategy, where you grab some good line in the conversation and put it as the title, because that's a great line.
But really, because like if you're so committed to any of this, how can you suddenly, like, even a deep continuity like John Vervaeke talks about, if you're so committed to this, why wouldn't you talk about it at its deepest possible level? Now you will use language like, oh, because that's just not pragmatically useful. But in your ultimate ontology, everything is connected. So why are you choosing this arbitrary level? Is it just a post hoc justification for you wanting to? That's kind of what I see the project of a lot of people being, like, from the new atheist days to now. It's to justify in some sort of a physicalist, materialist way all the ontology, and then just operate as if wisdom and stuff can be talked about in the usual, normal, common ways that normal people speak about them. Not normal people, but like people usually generally speak about wisdom. So like they might, like Sam Harris might be a determinist, but then in another instance he might just talk about but that they might talk about like consent in some
right
court case between like women and men being some, they just talk about it in the normal language. Why wouldn't you incorporate the determinism language there?
That's right. Well, and
why just the get out of jail card. Oh no, because this is humans, we've emerged beyond that. What?
No, I agree. And someone who I've spoke to recently said, you know, they used to be a fan of Sam Harris until they basically, someone asked Sam Harris, okay, you got all this determinism. Do you believe that with your children? No, I lied to them. And it's like, well okay. What on earth does that mean, Sam? You know, and this again is a point that Lewis just made it again and again and again, and Miracles and so many of his other books, that on one hand out here, they're making all of this, having all this fancy talk about this stuff, but it's not the world that they live in. And in all fairness, that's what pastors gripe at people in church about too, because they do all this fancy talk and they don't live as if Jesus rose from the dead for them. And we as human beings are tremendously bad at living according to even our own principles.
That's true. I'm just gonna zoom through this for 1 second.
Okay, we got about 5 more minutes.
I know. that's why I'm zooming through the notes. Okay, so the last point I think, which would be like quick to touch on, is like so do you feel like ultimately, since you have conversations with people like John Vervaeke and countless other people who see like, and there's almost this assumed idea that the mission is the same, and that mission is the preservation of the species or the flourishing of the species.
Yeah.
Like the flourishing of the species, whatever, meaningfully, like, and all of those will, for other people, like more secularly minded people, will be tied towards preservation of the species in some. But like in the Christian view, ultimately we are not in the hands of preserving our own species. In fact, it's almost been foretold that we will fail at being our own salvation. So even like a Jordan Peterson who's kind of his telos and his eschatology is kind of like, who knows how far we could take this if we all just got it's a very, and then I get the biblical and for someone who talks a lot about the Tower of Babel, Jordan Peterson I'm talking about, I think that story should have just kind of shot into his brain the moment he said, who knows how far we can take it, because it's like, I think it's been foretold that you can't take it that far if you were to have an honest reading. So like there is a fundamental, I see there being a fundamental clash between our vision, not our vision, I don't want to
Christian
project on you, but or the Christian world's vision of what God's ultimate purpose is, and our ability to save ourselves, which is non-existent, and the secular idea of us being able to save ourselves.
Yes. No, that's right. But I think there's overlap in that. I mean, one of my favorite passages of the Bible is the beginning of the book of Acts, where Jesus' disciples come to him and say, "Now will you restore the kingdom to Israel?" And Jesus dodges them. He says, "Well, it's not for you to know the times and the place, but you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes on you, and you will be my witnesses." And I think that is I think witnesses of Christ, witnesses for Christ, witnesses with Christ, this is the Christian mission. And this has to do with, bearing witness. And so we bear witness for samples of the life of the age to come. That's what I think Jesus' miracles were. And I think we use whatever power we have to do that. And so in many ways, many of the projects of modernity deeply embedded within Christianity have been wonderful things, where there are fewer wars, where I was just reading, the Metaphysical Club, and John Dewey had a very beloved child, and that child died of encephalitis, I think it was. And today, in many cases, if born in a place like Canada or the United States, that child likely would have been saved. That's a good thing. That's a witness to the kingdom. And I think so, having conversations with, basically in the beginning of the book of Acts, Jesus says, you're going to go out there and you're going to be my witnesses in, 10,000 different places with people of all sorts of different realms and persuasions. And the Holy Spirit is going to have to teach you how to do that. And so that's what we do. And I agree with you 100%. I don't think we can save ourselves. I don't think we can save this world. And people are like, I know there's plenty of climate skeptics on my channel or my listeners, which is fine. And I'm not one of them. And people are like, well, don't you think that we're putting humanity at risk? Yeah. Well, we've sort of been doing that right from the start. What kind of, at what point in humanity haven't we put the species at risk? Well, now it's on a global scale. Yeah, probably. But, we've all been at risk all the time, right from the start. From the moment you're conceived, you're at risk in this world. It's just the way it is. And what I find in Christianity is not necessarily an escapism, but it's really hard to argue that Jesus Christ didn't make the world remarkably better, especially given the fact that, as Rene Girard notes, almost all the enemies of Christianity in the West try to use, basically assume Christianity and argue against the church. And it's like, then we got a civil war, because I'm not sad about that situation. So no, you're very much right. And so we bear witness as best we can wherever we are. And that's some of what I hope to do on my YouTube channel. So it's why I make videos. Sometimes I'm a bad witness, but I just pray that God will, use whatever he wills and do good things with it and bless the world. So that's my mission. I got to run because I got someone coming up in a minute. So
well, thank you so much.
Thank you. We'll have to talk again. This was fun. So yeah, everybody. If I have your permission to post this,
yeah, for sure,
I'll post it, and everybody on the Discord server is going to be like, you got to get on the Discord server. We want to talk to you. So there you go.
Okay.
Thanks for talking.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.